Today, we are going to talk about how even though Ted can produce more telephones per hour and more lamps per hour than Bill, due to comparative advantage, there is still an opportunity for them to increase production and consumption for trade. To find their comparative advantage, we need to calculate what is the opportunity cost of producing one telephone for Bill and Ted, and the opportunity cost of producing one lamp for Bill and Ted. Bill can produce 2 telephones for every 6 lamps. We want to know how many lamps does he give up to produce 1 telephone. To figure this out, we take 2 and divide it by itself to make it 1. When we do this, we also divide 6 by 2. That equals 3. That lets us know for every 1 telephone Bill makes, it costs him 3 lamps. We're now going to do the same thing for Ted. Ted can make 4 telephones an hour, or he can make 20 lamps an hour. We divide telephones by 4 to turn it into a 1, and we divide 20 by 4 to see how many lamps he can make in exchange for 1 telephone. We discover that 1 telephone costs Ted 5 lamps. Now, we are calculating the opportunity cost of producing 1 lamp for Bill and Ted. For Bill, he can make 6 lamps in an hour. If we divide 6 by 6, that makes it 1. We also need to divide telephones by 6, 2 divided by 6, to figure out the opportunity cost of 1 lamp. We discovered that 1 lamp costs 1/3 of a telephone. We will now do the same thing for Ted. Ted can make 20 lamps an hour. We need to divide that by 20 to turn it into 1. After we divide it by 20, we also divide telephones by 20 to see how much telephones he's giving up to make 1 lamp. 4 divided by 20 equals 1/5. Once we have calculated the opportunity cost, we can then find out who has the comparative advantage to produce what. We can think of the opportunity cost as a currency, lamps instead of dollars. 1 telephone costs Bill 3 lamps to make. 1 telephone costs Ted 5 lamps to make. 3 is less than 5. So Bill can make telephones for less than Ted. Let's look at lamps. It costs Bill 1/3 of a telephone to make a lamp, and it costs Ted 1/5 of a telephone to make a lamp. That means it costs Ted less than Bill to make a lamp. Ted has a comparative advantage in making telephones over Bill. What if they were to engage in trade? We would have to find the price they would be willing to exchange with each other at. One way to look at this is to look at what you would have to pay Bill for Bill to supply Ted telephones. You cannot pay Bill less than 3 lamps to buy a telephone. If you offer him 2 lamps, Bill would look at you and he would say, instead of making 1 telephone, I could have made 3 lamps, and I would have been better off making lamps instead of selling 1 to you for 2 lamps. So, to buy lamps from Bill, you must pay at least 3 lamps. Now you want to ask, if Ted wanted to buy a telephone, you have to ask, how much is Ted willing to pay to buy a telephone? Would Ted pay 6 lamps to buy a telephone? No, because he could make a telephone himself for a cost of 5 lamps. Ted would only be willing to pay 5 lamps or less to buy a telephone. Whatever price Bill and Ted agree on, we know from their opportunity cost it must fall somewhere between 3 and 5 lamps. Now, it doesn't have to be any particular number. This comes to the bargaining skills of Bill and Ted. But we also know if it falls out of that range, that it's not in the interest of either Bill or Ted to go through with the trade. To figure out if there is an increase in production and consumption before trade and after trade, we have to make some assumptions about Bill and Ted. First assumption, they can only work 6 hours. Second assumption, they agree to a price of 4 lamps equals 1 telephone. Third assumption, Bill wants exactly 2 telephones and as many lamps as possible. Fourth assumption, Ted wants exactly 80 lamps and as many telephones as possible. First, let's use these assumptions to see what happens before trade. If Bill wants exactly 2 telephones, then he can spend 1 of his 6 hours making telephones. So before trade, Bill will make 2 telephones. That gives him 5 hours to make lamps. Bill can make 6 lamps an hour, so Bill can make himself 30 lamps. Ted wants exactly 80 lamps. Ted can make 20 lamps an hour. It takes him 4 hours to make 80 lamps. That leaves Ted with 2 hours to make telephones. He can make 4 telephones an hour. So 2 times 4 will give him 8 telephones. That means, before trade, total aggregate consumption is 2 plus 8 telephones, which equals 10. And 30 plus 80 lamps, which equals 110. What happens with trade? Well, Bill still wants exactly 2 telephones. And Bill has a comparative advantage in making 2 telephones. So Bill still can make himself 2 telephones. And Ted still wants 80 lamps. And he has a comparative advantage in making lamps. So he can still make himself 80 lamps. Bill is going to have to ask himself, do I want to make my own lamps? Ted is going to have to ask himself, do I want to make my own telephones? Or they can ask each other, do we want to engage in trade? Ted is going to look at the opportunity cost of him making his own telephones. He discovers that 1 telephone cost him 5 lamps. He also sees that the price that he and Bill had agreed upon, 4 lamps for 1 telephone, is less than 5 lamps. Ted is going to want to engage in trade. Bill is also going to look at his opportunity cost, and he's going to see that 1 lamp cost him 1/3 of a telephone. But he's also going to see that at the agreed upon price with Ted, 1 lamp would only cost him 1/4 of a telephone. So that's going from 0.33333 to 0.25. a smaller number. So Bill is going to want to engage in trade as well. Ted knows that after making 80 lamps, he has 2 hours left over to make stuff either for his consumption or for trade. He knows that in 2 hours, he can make either 8 telephones or 40 lamps. Bill spent 1 hour making 2 telephones for himself, leaving him 5 hours where he could make either lamps for himself or he could make telephones for trade. In 5 hours, he can make 10 telephones. Since we know it's better for Bill and Ted to trade, the more they can trade, the more they should have in terms of stuff. Ted can make 40 lamps. Bill can make 10 telephones. And the price of 4 lamps for 1 telephone, they trade all of their extra production. That means that Ted gives Bill 40 lamps, and Bill will give Ted 10 telephones. We can now see how this affects total production. After trade, we have 2 plus 10 telephones to give us 12 telephones. For Ted and Bill in terms of lamps, we now have 40 plus 80 equals 120 lamps. What do we see? We see after trade, society has consumed and produced more telephones, 10 versus 12, and more lamps, 110 versus 120. We also see that both Bill and Ted are better off. Bill goes from consuming 30 lamps to consuming 40 lamps. And Ted goes from having 8 telephones to consume to having 10 telephones to consume. Comparative advantage explains why trade is beneficial, even when one person, Ted, is always better at producing stuff than another person, Bill. And why it's beneficial not just for Bill and Ted as individuals, but it's beneficial if you were to think of society as a whole in terms of aggregate production and consumption.